Football or soccer, depending on where you're from, has started riots, broken friendships, and fueled national pride. But what if I told you that in 1969, a World Cup qualifying match helped ignite a full-scale war between two countries? El Salvador and Honduras weren't just playing for a spot in the World Cup. They were battling over land, immigration, and national identity. The result? A war that lasted 100 hours, left thousands dead, and changed Central America forever. This is the football war, the strangest conflict you've never heard of. Before the war, El Salvador and Honduras were already on edge. Honduras, nearly 5 times larger than El Salvador, had a smaller population, but wealthier elites controlled most of the land. Meanwhile, El Salvador was overcrowded and had little farmland, forcing thousands of Salvadorans to migrate to Honduras. For years, Hondurans blamed Salvadoran immigrants for stealing land and jobs, while Salvadorans felt oppressed and unwanted in Honduras. By the late 1960s, tensions were boiling over. In 1969, Honduras and El Salvador faced off in a World Cup qualifying match to determine who would advance to the Mexico 1970 World Cup. The first match on June 8, 1969, was played in Honduras. Honduras won 1-0, but the game was overshadowed by violence and intimidation. Salvadoran players were kept awake all night by Honduran fans banging on their hotel doors, throwing rocks, and blasting car horns. After the loss, a Salvadoran woman, distraught over the defeat, took her own life, turning her into a symbol of national pride and anger. The second match, played in El Salvador on June 15, 1969, saw Salvadoran fans retaliate. Honduran players were met with hostile crowds, their hotel was surrounded all night, and violence erupted outside the stadium. El Salvador won 3-0, but by then, the matches had become more than just football. They were war. Honduran fans were attacked and beaten. Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras faced brutal retaliation, and both countries' governments exploited the crisis for political gain. By the time the third and final match was played on June 26, 1969, in Mexico City, both countries were on the verge of war. El Salvador won 3-2 in extra time, securing a spot in the World Cup, but neither side cared about football anymore. That same day, El Salvador cut all diplomatic ties with Honduras, claiming that the Honduran government failed to protect Salvadoran citizens. The border between the two countries became a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador launched a full-scale military invasion of Honduras. Salvadoran fighter jets bombed Honduran airports and military bases, while Salvadoran troops crossed the border in force. Honduras was caught off guard, but quickly mobilized its army, launching airstrikes of its own. Within hours, entire towns were under siege, civilians were fleeing for their lives, and both nations were fully at war. For the next 4 days, El Salvador and Honduras engaged in a bloody and chaotic war. Honduras bombed oil refineries in El Salvador, while Salvadoran forces pushed deep into Honduran territory. Civilians suffered the most. Thousands fled their homes, and both sides committed atrocities against civilians and prisoners. The world watched in shock as two nations fought over a World Cup match. On July 18, 1969, after 100 hours of war, the Organization of American States, OAS, stepped in, demanding an immediate ceasefire. Under pressure from the US and other Latin American nations, El Salvador and Honduras agreed to stop fighting. But the damage was already done. Over 3,000 people were dead, thousands more were displaced, and relations between the two nations were forever changed. The troops withdrew, but the scars remained. The war ended, but the deep-rooted problems between El Salvador and Honduras were never truly resolved. In the years after the conflict, Honduras expelled thousands of Salvadoran immigrants, fueling tensions for decades. The border remained tense, and it wasn't until 1980, 11 years later, that the two countries finally signed a peace treaty. As for football, El Salvador went to the 1970 World Cup and lost every match. The football war wasn't really about football. It was about land, immigration, and years of resentment, with a soccer match serving as the final spark. It remains one of history's strangest conflicts. A war fought over pride, nationalism, and a game. So what do you think? Was this war inevitable, or was it truly just about football? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more unbelievable history.